Hi Year 4, nice to see you again. We are continuing with our story, our epic adventure down the Amazon, and luckily we've only just arrived there in Manaus, so that's exciting stuff. Mozzie's ready. I've moved him down a shelf because he told me he got a bit scared sitting all the way up there, so hopefully he's feeling a bit more brave sat there, but also I think he wanted to try and get closer to you lot. I don't think he was actually scared of heights, because if you think about how high his normal perch is in the classroom, I think he's all right there. I think he's just wanting a bit of attention, if I'm honest. Yes, Moz, everyone can see your sock, don't worry. So let's get cracking with chapter 3. It's a bit of a longer chapter again today, so sit tight, get comfy, and enjoy. Maya had been certain that the twins would be at the docks to meet them, but there was no sign of them or their parents. The passengers had all left the ship, their luggage had gone through customs, the bustle of the quayside had died away, and still no one came up to them. "Do you think they've forgotten us?" said Maya, trying to sound offhand. Suddenly she felt very forlorn and incredibly far away from everyone she knew. "Don't be silly," snapped Miss Minton, but her nose looked even sharper than usual as she turned her head from side to side, searching the quayside. They had waited for over an hour when a man in a crumpled cream suit and a Panama hat came up to them. "I'm Raphael Lima, the agent of Mr. Carter," he said. He had a sad yellow face and a drooping moustache, and his hand, as he took theirs, was moist and limp. "Mr. Carter has sent the boat for you. He couldn't come himself." They followed him and the porter to a floating dock on which were moored boats of every kind, dugout canoes, fleet sailing boats with names like Firefly and Swallow, and trim launches with gaily striped awnings and gleaming paint. But the Carter's boat was painted a serious dark green, like spinach. The awning was dark green too, and there was no name painted on the side, only the word Carter to show who owned it. As they came up to the boat, an Indian who had been perched on one of the bales of rubber waiting to be loaded got up and threw away his cigarette. "This is Furo, the Carter's boatman. It is he who will take you there." And with another limp handshake, Lima was gone. Furo was not like the Indians they'd passed, smiling and waving, not like the sailors on the boat with whom Maya had joked. He showed them into the cabin and shrugged when they said they wanted to sit out on the deck. Then he started the engine, lit another cigarette, and stared, unsmiling, out at the dark river. They travelled for an hour up the Negro, leaving all signs of the town behind them. Without realising it, Maya had edged closer to Miss Minton. It was oddly different, this stretch of the river, straight and silent, with no sandbanks or islands, and no animals to be seen, and the Indians working the rubber trees, who looked up as the boat passed, and turned away. Then Furo pointed to the right-hand bank, and they saw a low wooden house painted the same dark green as the boat, with a veranda running its length. And, down on the jetty, waiting to greet them, were 4 people. A woman holding a parasol, a man in a sun hat, and 2 girls. "The twins!" cried Maya, her face alight. "Oh, look, there they are!" Her spirits rose with a bound. They were there, and everything was going to be all right. Miss Minton gathered up their belongings, the boat came in quietly, and without waiting for Furo to help her, Maya jumped out onto the jetty. Remembering her manners, she went first to Mrs. Carter and curtsied. The twins' mother was plump, with a heavily powdered face, a double chin, and carefully waved her hair. She looked like the sort of person who would smell of violets or lavender, but to Maya's surprise, she smelled strongly of Lysol. It was a smell Maya knew well because it was what the maids had used at school to disinfect the lavatories. "I trust you had a good journey," she said, and looked taken aback when Maya said it had been lovely. Then she called, "Clifford!" and her husband, who had been giving orders about the boat, turned around to do his duty. Mr. Carter was a thin, gloomy-looking man with gold-rimmed spectacles. He was wearing long khaki shorts and mosquito boots, and he didn't seem very interested in the arrival of either Maya or her governess. And now, as Miss Minton, in her turn, shook hands with the Carters, Maya was free to turn to the twins. She had imagined them well. They were fair, and they were pretty, and they were dressed in white. They wore straw hats, each of them with a different coloured ribbon around the rim, one pink, one blue, and the sashes around their flounced dresses matched the hats. Their fair ringlets, a little limp in the heat, touched their collars. Their round cheeks were flushed, their light blue eyes were framed by pale, almost colourless lashes. "I'm Beatrice," said the one with the pink ribbon and the pink sash. She gave Maya her hand. Even so short a distance from the house, she was wearing gloves. Maya turned from one to the other. Though they were so alike, down to the slight droop of their shoulders, she thought she'd always be able to tell them apart. Beatrice was just a little plumper and taller. Her eyes had a little more colour. Her scanty ringlets had more body than Gwendolyn's, and she had a tiny mole on her neck. It was as though Beatrice was the mould from which Gwendolyn had been taken, and she guessed that Beatrice was the older, if only by a few minutes. But now Gwendolyn held out her hand. She had taken off her glove, and her hand stayed in Maya's a little longer than Beatrice's had done. Then they turned to follow their parents into the house, but Maya lingered for a moment, looking down at the palm of her outstretched hand. Then she took her head, ashamed of her thoughts, and ran off after the others. An hour later, Maya and Miss Minton sat on upright chairs on the veranda having afternoon tea with the family. The veranda was a narrow wooden structure which faced the river but was completely sealed off from it by wire netting and glass. No breath of wind came from outside, no scent of growing things. 2 flypapers hung down on either side, on which dying insects buzzed frantically, trying to free their wings. On low tables were set bowls of methylated spirit in which a number of mosquitoes had drowned or were still drowning. The wooden walls were painted the same dark, clinical green as the house and the boat. It was like being in the corridor of a hospital. Maya wouldn't have been surprised to see people lying around on stretchers waiting for their operations. Mrs. Carter sat at a wicker table pouring tea and adding powdered milk. There was a plate of small dry biscuits with little holes in them and nothing else. "We have sent them specially from England," said Mrs. Carter, looking at the biscuits, and Maya could not help wondering why they'd taken so much trouble. She'd never tasted anything so dull. "You'll never find native food served at my table," Mrs. Carter went on. "There are people here who go to markets and buy the food the Indians eat, but I would never permit it. Nothing is clean. Everything's full of germs." The word germs made her mouth pinch up to a disapproving O. "Couldn't it be washed?" asked Maya, remembering the lovely fruit and vegetables she'd seen in the market. But Mrs. Carter said washing was not enough. "We disinfect everything in any case, but it doesn't help. The Indians are filthy, and if one is to survive out here, the jungle must be kept at bay." The jungle had certainly been kept at bay. There were no plants on the windowsills, none of the lovely orchids and crimson flame flowers that had been on the balconies of the houses they'd passed along the shore, and the garden was a square of raked gravel. "In England I always had cut flowers in the house," Mrs. Carter went on. "Lady Parsons used to say that no one could arrange roses better than me, didn't she, girls?" The twins nodded in exactly the same way, once down, once up. "Yes, Mamma," they said. "But not here," she sighed. "Lady Parsons is a relation," she explained, "a second cousin on my mother's side." "Do you have any pets?" Maya shyly asked Gwendolyn, who was sitting next to her. There seemed to be no kittens, no dogs, no canary singing in a cage anywhere in the dark house. In the corner, propped up against a chair, was a large flit gun full of fly spray. Gwendolyn turned to Beatrice. Maya had noticed already that it was usually Beatrice who spoke first. "No, we certainly don't have any pets," she said. "Pets bring in fleas and lice and jiggers," said Gwendolyn, smoothing down her spotless white dress. "And horrible worms," said Beatrice. "All right, girls, that will do," said Mrs. Carter. A maid came to bring more hot water. She had 2 gold teeth and the same sulky closed look as Furo the boatman, and when Maya smiled at her, she didn't smile back. "Did you bring us any presents?" Beatrice asked, and Maya said yes, and asked if she could get them from her case. "Oh, but those are made here. They're market things," said the girls when she came back. "We want proper presents from England." Maya tried not to feel snubbed, but then she caught Miss Minton's eye and said, "I wanted to bring some baby chicks," and the twins shuddered. "Now, Miss Minton, if you will come with me, I'll inform you of your duties," said Mrs. Carter. "Beatrice and Gwendolyn will show Maya where she is to sleep." The Carters had built their bungalow on land which had belonged to the Indians. The main rooms faced the river. The dining room with a large oak table and the button-back chairs, the drawing room furnished with overstuffed sofas, a marble clock and a large painting of Lady Parsons wearing a choker of pearls, and Mr. Carter's study. All the windows were covered in layers of mosquito netting, and the shutters were kept partly closed so that the rooms were not only hot but dark. From the front of the house, 2 extensions ran back towards the forest. Maya's room was at the end of one of these, a small bare room with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, a wooden table. There were no pictures, no flowers, and the smell of Lysol was overpowering. "Mama made them scrub it out 3 times, said Beatrice. It used to be a storeroom. There was only one window, very high, but there were 2 doors, which one led out into the corridor and one which was bolted. "Where does that door lead?" Maya asked. "Out to the compound where the servants live, the Indians. You must keep it locked always. We never go out there." "So how do you go outside?" Maya asked. "To the river, I mean, and to the forest." The twins looked at each other. "We don't go out because it's too hot and full of horrible animals. When we go anywhere, we go in the boat to Manaus. For our dancing lessons and piano lesson, and you mustn't go out either." Maya tried to take this in. It looked as though the Carters were pretending they were still in England. "The maid'll help you to unpack," said Beatrice. "She's stupid, but it's her job." "What's her name?" Maya asked. "Tapey." "Is she the one who brought us hot water for tea?" "Yes." Remembering the heavy, sullen face of the woman, Maya had said she could manage on her own. "All right, supper's at 7. There's a gong." As they opened the door, Maya heard Mrs. Carter's voice raised loudly in the corridor. "Just remember this, Miss Minton. I shall always know. Always." The twins looked at each other and giggled. "She's warning her not to remove her corset," they whispered. "Some of the other governesses tried to do it, but Mama can always tell." "Oh, but surely in this heat," began Maya, and bit off her words. She could imagine how uncomfortable those stiff, wired undergarments would be in this climate. Supper in the dining room, under the whir of the creaking fan, was not a cheerful meal. They ate tinned beetroot and tinned corned beef, both shipped out from England, followed by a green jelly which had not set and had to be chased over the plate with a spoon. When the Carters first came from England, their servants had cooked all the best dishes that were eaten in Brazil. Freshly caught fish served in a saffron sauce, sweet peppers stuffed with raisins and rice, roasted sweet corn and chunky soups. They'd picked fresh fruit for the Carters, mangoes and guavas and pomegranates, and had gone out each night to search for turtle eggs. But not for long. "Only British food will be served at my table," Mrs. Carter had said. So the servants had given up. They opened the tins that came from England. They poured boiling water onto whatever pudding powder Mrs. Carter had put out for them, not caring if it was rock hard or running off the plate, and went back to their huts to make themselves decent food at night. "Shall I call Miss Minton?" Maya had asked as they sat down. Perhaps she didn't hear the gong. "Miss Minton will have supper in her room," said Miss Carter. "Governesses join us at breakfast and lunch, but never at dinner. Miss Porterhouse never had dinner with us," said Beatrice. "Nor did Miss Chisholm." Maya was silent. She had had a governess before she went to the academy, but she'd been part of the family, sharing all meals except formal dinner parties, when she and Maya ate together in the schoolroom, and to her dismay, Maya felt a lump come to her throat as she remembered the warmth and laughter of her old home. After supper, the girls worked on their embroidery, and Mr. Carter went to his study. He'd said almost nothing during the meal, only complaining once, because the servants had moved some papers on his desk. "Can't trust anyone out here," he grumbled, and told Maya to beware, because all the Indians were out to cheat you. "I expect you must be tired after your journey," said Mrs. Carter, and Maya said yes, she was, and went back to her room. Presently there was a knock at the door, and Miss Minton came in. She looked at Maya's room in silence. "I'm next door," she said, "so you can always knock on the wall. Do you need any help with your hair?" Maya shook her head, but Miss Minton took the silver-backed hairbrush and started to brush the long, thick hair. She said nothing for a while, letting Maya gather herself together. "It's not quite like I thought it would be, is it?" said Maya ruefully. "I don't think the twins like me." "They will do when they get to know you. Remember, twins are used to living in their own world." She put down the brush and began to replait Maya's hair. Give them time. Yes, it's just, I don't really understand why the Carters offered to have me. Miss Minton opened her mouth and closed it again. She knew exactly why they'd offered to have Maya. Her interview with Mrs. Carter had made that absolutely clear, but she wouldn't tell Maya. The child had been hurt enough by her parents' death. You'll see, it will all look different in the morning. Have courage. Courage is the most important thing. Yes. Left alone, Maya climbed into bed. There was no fan. It was incredibly hot and stuffy, but she would have courage. She stretched out her hand and looked at the tiny bruise on the skin. It was silly to think that Gwendolen had dug her fingernail into her palm. Why would she want to have hurt someone she'd never met? She must have had something caught under her nail and not realised. A tiny piece of wire or a thorn. But not a thorn from a rose, in this house without flowers. Maya turned out the lamp, but still she could not sleep. After a while she got up and pulled up a chair to the window. Out there in the forest were the huts of the Indians who worked for the Carters. Not cool native huts with thatched roofs, but wooden shacks built to house servants. She lifted a corner of the mosquito net and saw fireflies, 100 points of dancing light, and heard the croaking of frogs. How alive it was out there, and how dead inside the house. As she watched, she saw a girl in a bright frock carrying a baby on her hip go into the middle of the hut. As she opened the door, there was a jabber of a tame parrot, the brief yapping of a little dog. Then came the sound of singing, a low crooning song, a lullaby for the baby perhaps. Then silence again. But just before she left the window, she heard somebody whistling. The sound came from behind the end hut, set a little way back into the forest, where the rubber gatherers slept. But the strange thing was that she knew the tune. It was a North Country air, Blow the Wind Southerly. Her mother had sung it often. She listened till it died away and went back to bed. Hearing the familiar tune so far away from home had comforted her, and almost at once she slept. Mr. and Mrs. Carter had come to the Amazon from Littleford-on-Sea, a small town in the south of England. Mr. Carter had worked in a bank, but he'd lost his job and decided to take his family to the Amazon to make his fortune. Many Europeans went out there at that time, some to plant coffee or cocoa, some to try and find gold, but most to harvest rubber, the black gold of the Amazon. It sounded an easy way to get rich. Rubber trees grew all over the Amazon basin. All one had to do was hire some Indians to collect the sap from the trees, take it to the sheds to be smoked, and send the balls of crude rubber down the river to be exported. And certainly a lot of people had made their fortunes. There were people in Manhouse who lived like princes, but not the Carters. Because to get the juice from the rubber trees, you need Indians who know the forest and understand the trees. And Indians are proud people who have their own lives. If you treat them like slaves, they don't revolt or go on strike. They simply melt back into the forest, join their tribes and disappear. And this is what happened to the Indians when which the Carters had employed. Every month, Mr. Carter lost someone of his workforce, and far from making his fortune, he was getting poorer and poorer. So when Mr. Murray had written to ask if they'd have Maya to live with them, the Carters had been overjoyed. They didn't want Maya, they were far too selfish to want anybody, but they needed her. Or rather, they needed the money she brought with her. Mr. Murray had never told Maya how much money her father had left her. She didn't need to have to worry about having enough, and she seldom thought about it. But the fact that she was now rich and would be richer when she was 21, the Carters had explained that life was very expensive on the Amazon. Everything had to be shipped from England, every digestive biscuit, every jar of marmalade. So they'd asked for a very large sum of money for having Maya to live with them. We'd love to have her for nothing, Mrs. Carter had written, but times are hard. Mr. Murray had agreed, but he was a careful man, as lawyers are. He had sent the first month's keep with Miss Minton, for he knew she could be trusted. Later, Maya's allowance and the salary he was paying Miss Minton to look after her would go straight into a bank in Manhouse, and Miss Minton had only taken a few minutes to realise why the Carters wanted Maya. Mrs. Carter had not been able to hide her relief and her greed as Miss Minton counted out the notes the lawyer had trusted her with. As for Beatrice and Gwendolen, they'd been told nothing, only that a distant cousin was coming to stay with them and must be welcomed, but the twins had never welcomed anybody in their lives. Maya woke up the next morning. not to the sound of a bird song, but to the noise she couldn't place at first, a sort of swishing, squelching noise followed by thumps and bumps and cries of "Out!" She put her head around the door. In the corridor, wearing a dressing gown and a turban to protect her hair, was Mrs. Carter. She had the flint gun in her hand and was carefully squirting every nook and cranny with insect killer. Then she disappeared into the cloakroom, fetching a broom, and began to thump and bang on the ceiling to get rid of possible spiders. Next came a bucket full of disinfectant and a mop which she squelched across the tiled floor, and all the time she muttered "Out!" or "That will settle you" to the insects that she thought might be there. Mrs. Carter did nothing else in the house, but this early morning hunt was one that she did not trust to the servants. Then, after breakfast, Maya started lessons with the twins. They did them in the dining room, sitting at the big oak table. The room was already hot at 8 in the morning, and they could not use a fan because it blew the pages of the books about, and the smell of insect killer were added to the other morning scents of the house: carbolic soap, Lysol, and Jay's fluid. Mrs. Carter had given clear orders to Miss Minton. The girls work from a set of books by Dr. Bullman. As you see, the books cover all the subjects they will need. She pointed to Dr. Bullman's English grammar, Dr. Bullman's English composition, Dr. Bullman's French primer, Dr. Bullman's History of England, and Dr. Bullman's Geography. All the books had the same brown covers, and on each one was a picture of Dr. Bullman himself. He had a pointed beard, staring eyes, and a bulging forehead, and as Maya looked at him, she felt a slight lurching of the stomach. "I want you to stick absolutely to the exercises in the books," Mrs. Carter went on. "No making things up, no straying. I've always made this a rule. Then, when a governess leaves, the next one knows exactly where to take over." "Yes, Mrs. Carter." "Every 3 months a progress report is sent out to Dr. Bullman in England. You will, of course, show me yours before you send it." She gave a couple of squirts with the flit gun in the direction of the window where a small fly had appeared. "You'll find the books very clear and easy to use," she said, and left. The twins were dressed in white again. Today Beatrice had a green ribbon in her hair, and Gwendolyn's was yellow. Seeing them so fresh and pretty made Maya ashamed of her thoughts the night before, and she smiled at them. They would be friends in the end, she was sure of it. Miss Minton looked at the timetable. English grammar was first. She opened Dr. Bullman at the page with a marker. "That's where we were when Mrs. Porterhouse left," said Beatrice with a sly look at her governess. "She left suddenly," said Gwendolen. "Mamma sent her away." Miss Minton gave her a steely glance. "Beatrice, read out the paragraph, 'The use of the comma,' please." "The comma is used to divide a sentence into phrases," read Beatrice. She read slowly and with difficulty, and Maya looked up, surprised, for Beatrice was older than her, and they'd done the use of the comma 2 years earlier at the academy. "Now, Gwendolen, look at the first exercise. Where does the comma go in that sentence?" Gwendolen's round blue eyes looked puzzled. After station?" "No, have another look." The morning dragged on. Dr. Bullman's exercises were the most boring Maya had ever seen, and the girls worked so slowly that she had to look away so as to hide her expression. But when Miss Minton asked Maya to read a paragraph, she stopped her almost at once. "All right, Maya, that will do," she said crossly, and Maya looked up, puzzled. It was a ridiculously easy passage, surely that she'd not read it wrong, but Miss Minton did not ask her to read again. After English grammar came English composition. Dr. Bullman did not believe that children should write stories using their imaginations. He gave set subjects, examples of how to begin, how to end, and the number of words they were to use. Then came French, and Maya had to sit in silence while the twins stumbled over phrases she'd learnt the year before in her first year. But the boredom was not as bad as knowing that she'd upset Miss Minton. The governess had gave her no chance to read or take part. She didn't even look at her. Maya had begun to think of Miss Minton as her friend, but clearly she was wrong. At 11, Miss Carter came back with the flit gun, followed by a sullen maid with a jug of tinned orange juice and 4 of the dry biscuits they'd had the day before. "Would you like to take your 11sies in the garden?" suggested Miss Minton. The twins looked at her in amazement. "We never go out into the garden," said Beatrice, looking at the raked square of gravel which an Indian was spraying with something. "You get stung." offered Gwendolen. So they stayed in the hot room with the loudly ticking clock. After break came arithmetic. The twins were better at that, and as it was Maya's weakest subject, she was able to work out the sums without too much boredom. But history, which for Dr. Borman was the history of England and nowhere else, was deadly. The repeal of the Corn Laws and the list of pointless dates. There was no one lesson which touched on the lives of the twins in Brazil. Geography was about coach building in Birmingham, and RI was about a girl who could not read her Bible and was struck down by a terrible disease. After lunch, the twins did needlework in the drawing room, watched by their mother, who kept the flit gun by her chair, as other women might keep a pet dog, a dachshund or a Pekingese. Beatrice was embroidering a table mat with primroses. Gwendolen's was covered in violets. Maya was given a square of linen and a skein of embroidery thread. "What are you going to put on yours?" asked Beatrice. "I thought I'd like to do one of those big red lilies that grow everywhere here. Canna lilies, I think they're called." Beatrice made a face. "Oh, you don't want to do them. They're native flowers and they're nasty. Mother says they're a breeding ground." Maya looked up, surprised. "What are they a breeding ground for?" "Horrid things. Things that bite you and make you ill. They crawl out of the inside." Another hour of lessons followed. Then Miss Minton suggested that they might like to read some poetry, and Maya's face lit up. "Oh, must we?" asked Beatrice. "Can't we just go on with the exercises?" "Very well," said Miss Minton, ignoring Maya's disappointed face. The afternoon ended with the twins' piano practice. They did exactly half an hour each, with the metronome set, scales, arpeggios, the dance of the butterflies, the merry pheasant, and after half an hour exactly they stopped, even if they were in the middle of a bar. "And you, Maya?" asked Miss Carter. "Did you have a piano lessons in England?" "Yes, I did," said Maya, looking longingly at the piano. "Well, tomorrow you shall have your turn to practice. I have rather a headache coming on now." As she sat at supper, to which Miss Minton was not allowed to come, it occurred to Maya that the twins had not been outdoors once. Not for 5 minutes to look at the river or to take a stroll. "How am I going to stand it?" thought Maya. Shut up like a prisoner. Back in her room, she turned out the lamp and pushed the chair under the window, as she had done the night before. She was beginning to make out the people who lived there. In the middle hut lived Furo the boatman, and Tapy, the sullen maid, to whom he was married. But it was from there that the singing had come, so there had to be other people living there. So sulky a woman could not have sung such a song. The girl with the baby lived in the hut on the left. She was the wife of the gardener who sprayed Mrs. Carter's gravel, and was half Portuguese, which was why her baby sometimes wore nappies instead of running naked as the Indian babies did. The little dog belonged to her. There was a chicken run behind the huts. An old woman with long grey hair came out sometimes to feed them, and she had heard the grunting of a pig, but all the animal noises were quickly hushed for fear of the Carters, she guessed. The next 3 days were exactly the same. The sound of squirting and stamping at dawn, Dr. Borman's boring lessons, unspeakable meals, tinned fish in a bluish sauce, endless beetroot and cornflower shape that seemed to quiver with fear as Tapy brought it to the table. The twins, who had always looked so clean and fresh in the morning, were flushed and grumpy by the end of the day. Mr. Carter scarcely spoke and disappeared into his study, and whenever it was Maya's turn at the piano, Mrs. Carter had a headache. But Maya would have coped with it all. What really upset her was Miss Minton. Her governess went on ignoring her in lessons and never let her read or answer any questions, while Beatrice and Gwendolen became more and more smug as they saw Maya being shown up as a fool. I must have made her angry, thought Maya, but try as she would, she could not think about what she'd done. Then, on the 4th night, there was a knock at the door, and Miss Minton entered. "Right," she said. "Come down off that chair. I think we're ready for the next step." "What do you mean?" "I'm going to see Mrs. Carter tomorrow. I shall tell her that you're not able to keep up with the twins in lessons. But," Miss Minton held up her hand, "don't interrupt, please. I shall tell her that I will set you work separately because you're holding the twins back. This means that I'm trusting you to work on your own. I shall, of course, help you whenever I can, but you must keep up the deception." She gave one of her tight smiles. "I don't see why we shouldn't have an interesting time. I have a book about the history of Brazil, and one by Bates, the explorer who first described this part of the Amazon, and another by Humboldt, a very great scientist. The twins may live as though they're still in Littleford-on-Sea, but there's no need for us to do so. Maya jumped from the chair. "Oh, Minty," she said, and threw her arms around her governess. "Thank you. I'm sorry. I thought—" "Well, don't," said Miss Minton briskly. And then, "Come along, it's time we opened my trunk." Miss Minton had been poor all of her life. She had no trinkets, no personal possessions. Her employers underpaid her when they paid her at all. But her trunk was an Aladdin's cave. There were travel books and fairy tales, novels and dictionaries and collections of poetry. "How did you get them all?" Maya asked wonderingly. "How did you manage?" Miss Minton shrugged. "If you want something enough, you usually get it. But you have to take what goes with it," and she pointed to her shabby blouse and mended skirt. "Now, let's see, what shall we start with? Ah, yes, here is Bates. He must have sailed down this river not 60 years ago. Look at that drawing of a sloth." And that's the end of chapter 3. So that was a long chapter, wasn't it? But quite a lot happened. So how do you think you would have felt if you had this image of somebody or a family in your head and it wasn't quite as you expected? So you can kind of imagine and put yourself in Maya's shoes. I think I would have felt a bit disappointed and a bit lonely there, but hopefully you enjoyed it. Thank you very much for listening, and chapter 4 will be on Monday now, so have a lovely weekend, stay safe and be good. Lots of love. Bye.